This is a super brief primer on color as it pertains to graphic design, and it definitely won't cover everything because it's quite a broad topic. So, first, as just a quick exercise, I want to give you a few seconds to picture the exact color that comes to mind if you're asked to imagine the color red. And then pick out which one of these swatches is closest to that color red. And if we were in the classroom, we would have a ton of different answers. And what this shows is that color is a super personal stimulus, and we relate to it differently. Color is also one of the most powerful visual stimuli, and so it is difficult to control and it's important to control. Oftentimes, when we're designing, it's highly advisable that you start designing in black, white, and gray without using color because color is so powerful and we want to be able to focus on the contrast and form before we start adding in things like color. Like I said, it's also very subjective. Colors differ by the individual, the context that they're presented in, both the visual context of what else is on the page, as well as the semantic context of what the message is about, and the culture that they are being perceived in. A couple of brief definitions that will be helpful for things like critique as we're talking about color. The hue refers to the color's wavelength on the light spectrum. Oftentimes, hue is what we are naming when we talk about color. So, like I would call these red, green, and purple or magenta. But that name is actually only one aspect of these colors. That is the hue or the wavelength of them. They also have other properties such as saturation, which is the dullness or brightness of a color. You can think about this as the strength. So these are all the same hue of red, but they've been desaturated going from left to right. So you see it moves closer to almost a gray value as it loses the saturation. Temperature is the warmth or coolness of a color. Warm colors tend to advance in space, while cool colors tend to recede. And so it looks like the areas of red are coming towards us while blue falls away. And when we challenge that, sometimes it can create some dissonance on the page. Colors can also be warmer or cooler as they relate to each other. So one color blue could be warmer than another color blue, even though we think of them both as cool colors. Value refers to the relative brightness of a color, which is different than saturation. This is the amount of like white or black that is mixed in if we were thinking about color as like paint or a physical mix of color. You can also mix in gray, which we call tones. So when you add white, you get a tint. When you add black, you get a shade. And when you add gray, you get a tone. Different hues also have their own inherent values. So you can see the spectrum of light here converted to black and white, and you can see that different values translate to different shades of gray. So this is why if you put yellow text on a white page, it's nearly impossible to read because yellow is an inherently bright color. So with those definitions out of the way so we can talk about them, now we can talk about color in communication. So the first thing to talk about is value contrast. Value contrast is how we differentiate form. So it's really important that your designs have contrast between any two colors on a field. So on the left here, you'll see that I'm using green and pink, and we can perceive those different colors, but it's quite hard on the eye. The reason for that is because there is not enough value contrast between those colors. So as I've converted it to black and white on the right, you'll see that those are almost the same shade of gray, so they have the same value. Again, this is why it's helpful to start your work in black and white so that you aren't thinking about color as you're trying to look at composition. So you can see here, this darker shade of purple creates a lot more contrast with that green, so it's much easier to discern the forms. Perceiving the value of colors is something that's pretty hard to do. So, one thing that's really helpful is to keep a layer on your designs that is a filter to convert things to black and white, where you can assign a shortcut to your keyboard to flip your display to black and white, which is really helpful to flip between as you're sort of like assigning colors to be able to check those value contrasts. We also see color differently. So, value is really important for accessibility, and it's really important that you don't rely on color alone for any communication or any specific messaging. You can see here how these different colors are perceived differently depending on different types of color blindness. Color also differs by context. So, if I show you a picture of a heart and it's red, we associate the color red with passion and excitement and love. But if we were to change that same color and apply it to a different symbol, suddenly the red symbol's caution or danger. The same thing happens if we were to shift the cultural context that a color is perceived in. So, for example, in the West, white is a color of cleanliness and celebration and purity. But in other cultures, white can be a symbol of death, depending on the rituals that surround those colors or the context that they're typically seen in. We can demonstrate how powerful color is as a design tool by noticing the way that it draws the eye. So if I were to flip through these slides, notice how your eye is immediately drawn to the green dot. And this is how designers can control where your eye goes on the page if they're using, one saturated color compared to other neutral tones in the composition. It's really easy to pick this out when you look at something like a website or a landing page. So if we look at this page here, we can see that green is the most important color on the page, and the things that are green are the things that they want us to click on. It also helps us group elements together. So this is where that repetition with variation can come in. So this is an infographic and it's much too small to see what this is actually about. But our eye visually groups the different colors together. So even though some of these dots are all over the page, we imagine that the red dots have something in common, as well as the yellow and the blue on the page. You have probably throughout your primary education and art classes learned some very basic color harmony rules. Things like the color wheel, the primary colors and the way those are mixed to create secondary colors, which are in between them, and then tertiary colors, so on and so forth, as you move around the color wheel. And this is helpful for starting to build color schemes. You may be familiar with the different color schemes that are here. So monochromatic is using different tints and shades of the same color. Analogous is taking things that are next to each other on the color wheel. Complementary is taking the exact opposite color on the color wheel or very close. Split complementary moves that complementary color to the left and right on the color wheel. Triads are equidistant, and then tetradic is equidistant but for different colors. So this is a helpful starting point, but color harmony rules on their own really aren't enough to create a successful color palette, and they're definitely not enough to use them successfully in design. The way that they're applied and the context that they're applied in is also super important. There's a design educator named Joseph Albers who's super influential in how designers think about color. And he taught color by using different pieces of colored paper, and students would do experiments with them. So, for example, if you look at this plate here that's on the page and look at the neutral squares that are in the center, those almost brown colors, take a second to think about which one of those looks darker or lighter compared to the other one. If we move the strips in the middle, we can see that that is actually the exact same color. It's one connected piece of paper, but it appears in two different ways because of the background those colors are against. So one of the things that Albers is showing us is that we can make one single color appear as two, depending on the context that surrounds it. We can see another example here. So looking at the purples on the left and the right, and taking note of which one of these looks darker and which one looks lighter to your eye. And then if we place them right next to each other, we can see that these are also the same color. But because those strips of paper, the color of them is lighter than the background on the right, that piece appears lighter than the one on the left because the one on the left is slightly darker than the background that it is on. Here, the goal is to make the central swatches of paper appear like the background on the opposite side. And this example shows how a third color can almost be made to disappear depending on the background that it's placed against. The more colors you work with, the more difficult it becomes to balance, so it can be really helpful to start with something like a monochromatic or an analogous color scheme, and then work your way up to balancing more and more colors. Another helpful starting point is the 60-30-10 rule. This means that 60% of your layout should be one color, 30% a second, and then 10% being your saturated accent color. You can see this at play on this screen, where about 60% of the screen is this off-white, and then 30% is the very dark neutral, which looks like black, but it's actually a very dark green. And then that highly saturated green is saved for the 10%, the call to action, which is both in the picture as well as on the button. Another thing that can help unify your color palettes is if you're working with blacks and whites, add a very subtle amount of saturation to them to match one of the colors in your palettes, which will help unify those neutrals with the rest of your palette. There are also different ways that color is created. So in your design software, you will often see RGB color or CMYK. RGB color is additive color, which means that when a screen is off, it starts as black, and then there are different pixels that are blue, red, or green, and depending on the ways that those light up, can create the different colors that are possible on the spectrum of that monitor. And when they all mix together, they create white. So you should be working in RGB when you are working on screen-based projects. There's also subtractive color, which is the format you're working in when you're working with printed materials. So a lot of printers will use cyan, magenta, yellow, and black ink. And when those colors are layered on top of each other, they get denser. And then when you add them all together, you get black. CMYK isn't enough, though, to create all colors that are possible on the spectrum. So there's another mode of working, which is called working with spot colors. So Pantone is the most popular here in the West, which is a color matching system where the printer will not work with cyan, magenta, yellow, and black ink, but instead they will mix together various tints and shades of Pantone colors, which gives a wider range. And it also guarantees that whatever comes out of the printer will be the color that the designer intended as long as they were matched to a Pantone swatch. This is really helpful for standardizing prints. It's also really important for brand colors if the color is important to how people think about a brand. So for example, the red of Coca-Cola is very important. So they might use a spot color for when they're printing their materials. And that's just a brief overview. Color is something that's a lifelong learning project for designers and artists. But hopefully this gives you a brief overview for starting to apply it in your own work.